Secrets Beyond the Screen is a book not only about TV industry in Australia, and we have got so many good stories to share with you today. But Anita was also at a dinner party a few years ago, and she was asked a question about her much beloved father, and we will talk about that a little bit later on. So Anita has one of the dubious reputations of being one of the few people to be expelled out of PLC, having grown up on Sydney's leafy Upper North Shore, raised by her mum and dad in a beautiful family, but she's also a rebel. Anita, tell us about growing up and why you got expelled.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Penny. Yes, as you said, I grew up on the leafy North Shore, which I found was a bit like growing up in Rookwood. It was so very, very quiet. But I should say that I grew up with a family that was very warm and very close. I was very lucky. But my parents, both of them were political refugees who'd both fled terrible situations. My father was born in Prussia. He, just before the First World War, he was a much older father. I'm not as
really young.
Yeah, I'm not as old as this might sound. But he was a young boy during the First World War. He was there for the Spanish pandemic when 20 to 50 million people died throughout Europe. He watched the rise of Nazism in Germany. His family lost everything when the Depression happened in 1929 because they had German bonds. And then in the early 1930s, as Hitler was coming to power and becoming Chancellor of the Weimar Republic in 1933, my father was thrown into jail. He had discovered that we had Jewish heritage in our background, and Hitler didn't differentiate between whether your mother was a Jew or your father was, under old Jewish law. He was just a Jew. So he had a terrible time with the Nazis, and he took them on, which was his way. And then he had to flee Germany and with his life, and he managed to choose a country on the other side of the world. My mother...
Which is interesting, actually, because a lot of people did that.
They did.
Could not get farther away from...
Exactly, yeah. And he left his parents and their family. I, to this day, don't know anything about my extended family in Germany. Nothing at all. My mother had a similar situation. She was born in Harbin in Manchuria, in northern China, and her mother, my grandmother, had fled the Russian Revolution when she was 16. She'd actually taken a train up to Harbin, escaping what was happening with the revolution, and she never saw her family again.
So they were both really remarkably brave to do what they did. Very
brave, and they both landed in Australia with absolutely nothing. And I think people will understand here, when you're a refugee and you're fleeing, particularly a war-torn or a tumultuous country, you are about looking forward. You're not about looking back, and that's what my parents were all about. Looking forward, they never talked about their past. I think you'll find this replicated time and time again. And they were also about creating opportunities for their children. And that's hence how I ended out at a private girls' school. Not because I wanted to go there, but my parents wanted me to have the best education that they could afford.
So PLC was the place you went and you got expelled?
Yes, well, PLC in those days had a particularly strict headmistress. I'm talking about many years ago. It's not the same school today, I'd really like to add. And at the age of 13, I found it I'd grown up in a household that was very liberal, a lot of culture. We had films, theatre. I know John Bell was here earlier. I would go to the Nimrod when I was really young. I would go and hear opera and art, and I was very fortunate in that way. They were very cultured, both of them.
It was also a very European thing to do then as well.
Very European. My father spoke 5 languages, my mother spoke 3 to 4 languages, so they were very, very cultured, and I feel really fortunate to have grown up in that background. But when I got to school, I found it very rigid, and I guess because of my parents' background, they weren't strict parents.
Yeah.
They were just, I had latitude to be who and what I was, and to find out who and what I was, like most kids.
So when you did finally get expelled, how did they feel about that, having, thought that you were in a pretty safe place for your education?
It's interesting, my father didn't, because of what had happened in his world, and that's why I mentioned some of the extraordinary events in modern history that he dealt with, the education and his daughter mucking up, because I used to smoke, I would wag, I'd be quite outspoken, all the things that kids do. I mean, it doesn't mean that it defines who you and what you are later on in life. It just means you're pushing boundaries.
And you've pushed boundaries throughout
and
your
I did
whole
push
career.
boundaries.
Yeah.
And I think that's really... Look, I think there are ways of pushing boundaries that are acceptable. And when I was young, I didn't know what was acceptable.
Yeah.
I just did it.
So you left school and you ended up working for Kevin Weldon, and for some of you, you may know that name. He was one of the great Australian publishers and really changed the way of Australian publishing in many ways. And you also worked for the amazing Ita Buttrose at Australian Women's Weekly.
Yes.
What did you learn from both those incredible people?
So Kevin was... he set up Paul Hamlin's here in Australia. He was honestly the most entrepreneurial man, besides my father, I'd ever met. And what he did was, I started working there at 18 as a marketing trainee, and he gave each of us, there were 8 of us, he gave us an assignment to set up a meeting with somebody and go and interview them. And so my person that I had to set up a meeting, which was really at 18 quite hard, was the then CEO of the Westpac Bank. The Bank of New South Wales, which is now Westpac, a man called Sir Robert Norman. And I did all my research and I went and spent an hour with him. And I learnt through that experience that anybody is possible to talk to and that you shouldn't feel intimidated and scared about doing that. So it actually opened my world again. My father had opened my world and my mother. But then I had this entrepreneurial man teaching me that you could do anything. You could go and make an appointment with whomever. And I've told hundreds of stories throughout my career, and I can honestly say I've never really been intimidated by anybody.
Oh, good. But were you intimidated by Ita?
Well, Ita was really interesting. That's when she was the editor of the Women's Weekly, and I was there when I was about 19, 20, and I'd gone in there as a young journalist. And Ita then, I don't know how many of you saw Paper Giants on the ABC, yes? And Asha Keddy played Ita, and she was fantastic. But I actually had this conversation with Ita just recently because I chair the ABC Advisory Council, so we've come back to working together. And in any case, I said, Ita, when I worked with you, we were never allowed to wear pants, and yet Asha Keddy wore pants in that series. I had to go and buy a whole wardrobe of dresses.
Because Kerry Packer didn't want the women wearing pants.
No, that's right. So we all had to wear dresses. But Ida's the kind of woman that I particularly like because she empowers you to do what you can do. She doesn't interfere. You've got to prove your worth to her, and once you have, she's the most fabulous woman to work with.
But that gave you a lot of confidence too, and from that you decided to take a job with the happiest television show in the world, which was Simon Townsend's Wonder World, where Simon would go,
I'm sure everybody remembers. Does most people remember Simon Townsend's Wonder World? Yes.
And Woodrow. Fabulous Woodrow. And what was the happiest TV show on earth was really the most toxic workplace you'd ever worked in. So tell us a little bit what happened to you at Simon Townsend's Wonderworld.
Well, actually, I wouldn't say it is the most toxic because I actually then went into all the networks, the commercial networks, and that was infinitely worse. But so Simon, as you know, we did 5 half hours a week. It was a children's current affairs show. It won about 5 Logies. It was extraordinarily popular, and particularly with older people. And it spawned talent like Angela Concerns, Jonathan Coleman, Amanda Keller, a guy called Andrew Lesney who won an Academy Award for filming Lord of the Rings. So it was a seriously talented group of young people. But the culture in there was like a sweatshop. I'd come out of working at the Women's Weekly and run by these fabulous women into a culture run by men that was so toxic, that was bullying, that was harassment. And we as young women found that very hard to push back. This was way before the Me Too era, and very difficult for young women to find their place if you wanted to succeed in commercial television.
And you found that really difficult, so you left.
That's right. I challenged one of the authority figures there because I found the behaviour there was so unacceptable. Even at 21, I knew that behaviour was completely intolerable.
Been quite courageous to do that at that age and in that sort of culture, but you then decided that you might like to face out in front of a camera. So you went up to Newcastle and joined the team at NBN, and by your own admission, you really sucked in front of the camera.
That's right. Well,
And which also made me kind of think, Anita, what makes a good interviewer? What makes a good person in front of a camera?
Well, that's a really good question. It's actually about doing their homework initially and understanding what a story is about, who they're interviewing. It's also about the art of listening. It's not just listening to what somebody's saying, it's active listening and watching their body language. And it's also hearing what they're not saying rather than what they are saying, which is quite a skill. You know, in a courtroom, that's what a good barrister will try and do. In fact, the skills of a barrister in a courtroom are not dissimilar to what a good interviewer will do. But it's also empathy, it's doing your homework, and it's also finding out, if they're very famous, finding out something new about them, because we all know, you know, you pick up all these, if you're reading about, I don't know, Jane Fonda or whoever it is, you think you know all about that person, but your role as the interviewer is to come out and find something fresh about them that an audience doesn't know.
And in that, tell us who you think are really good interviewers that you've worked with.
Well, I think probably two of the best interviewers I've worked with, and the first one you'll probably think, why is she saying that? But he was and is a very good interviewer, is John Laws. John Laws comes with a great deal of general knowledge. He has great empathy, even if you can't see it. He does his homework, and he really listens to the everyman. He was a very, in his heyday, not now. In his heyday, he was a good interviewer. But Andrew Denton, I worked very closely with Andrew. We were co-EPs of Enough Rope for 6 years. In fact, we worked together for 10 years and did many shows together. And Andrew has great empathy. He listens. He does his homework. He understands body language. He's good at reading a room, and he knows how to get that interview from here to here. Because most of you know, actually great television, or you can't go past a great conversation with somebody.
Oh, absolutely. That's why, you know, who's the guy on BBC? Parkinson, thank you, Michael Parkinson.
Yeah.
You know, just watching him is just a joy. And actually, in Andrew Denton, I think we've all agree is one of the greatest interviewers. But we'll talk more about Andrew later on. Have you, in recent times, I guess you're looking at a lot of interviewers, and are you finding that the quality of Australian interviewing and media is still as sharp as it used to be?
No.
Oh, okay. That's honest.
No, unfortunately. I think because of the plethora of social media and the skills that we had to have as journalists were all about rigour, accuracy, really getting to the heart and nub of a story. And I think a lot of that, those absolute essentials are probably in some newsrooms and on some programs just aren't practiced today. And I think that's a great shame.
That makes you you seem sad about that.
I am sad about it because I don't think, also the kind of stories that we should be telling, the stories that we really need to know about. You know, would we know about asbestos today? Well, we've just found out Adele Ferguson wrote that fabulous story the other day about the silicosis. And, you know, so that was a genuinely important story for us to know about. But I don't think we do enough investigative journalism because we need to know what we don't know. Yeah. And I think what's happening is we've got an economic model in media and across other industries as well that's shot to pieces in a lot of ways.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that too. So then you went to Good Morning Australia with the fabulous Kerry Ann, who we all love, and the rather large Gordon Elliott. And that was a complete turnaround for you where you were a producer.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. There were times there where you could have really reached a higher level in your career. And we were talking earlier about toxic workplaces and the Boys Club, and Channel 9, Channel 10, 7 were all renowned for that Boys Club and the long
lunches. And I think we
lunches.
should say that I don't think the ABC and the public broadcasters had the same sort of culture as commercial television. I'm talking about in the 80s particularly, the early 80s, throughout the 80s into the early 90s. So a long time before the Me Too movement was really on all of our radars.
Yeah. But you experienced that sort of discrimination because you're a woman. Tell us about some of the things that happened to you there.
Well, for a start, as you mentioned, Kerry Ann and Gordon Elliott were hosting the show. Every morning, Gordon would just cut Kerry Ann dead. It was so fascinating to watch. And there was a sense of whoever was leading. Good Morning Australia was very similar to the Today Show is. They were the two breakfast shows in the morning. So we used to do 2 hours of live television. And live television is really, that's hard work because you're flying on the seat of your pants, and there you've got to think very clearly about ideas. But Gordon would consistently put Kerry-Anne down. And Kerry-Anne has made no bones about it. I'm not speaking out of school. She wrote in her autobiography exactly what she thought about Gordon. So I witnessed how a male might treat a female very publicly, and I thought that that was unacceptable. And I was a senior producer on that show, so I would, every second week, I would put the show to air, which meant going into the control room very early in the morning. I'd start at 3 a.m. in the morning. And then I would, and I was living out on the northern beaches of Sydney. It was a long drive in.
And you had to come into Tarman?
Beg your pardon? It used to be in North Ryde,
oh, that's
the old
right.
Channel
Yes,
10
yes.
studios at North Ryde. And it was, so I was the senior producer, I was putting the show to air, and I was always rotating with men. And every time one of my bosses would leave, in the next position up, I would put my hand up. But I would never get into that role.
And you were doing exactly the same job as the man.
Exactly the same job, because I was young and female. And so, in fact, at one stage, the EP of the show, the executive producer, brought in somebody to actually be my boss, or be that, you know, the next cog up below the executive producer. And that was just because he drank with him at the Bellevue in Woollahra, not because he knew anything about television or ideas or journalism. He really didn't.
That would have been incredibly disappointing, and your father then was really supportive of you and was pretty much saying to you, you don't have to put up with this.
Yes.
Do you want to read a little bit out of your book about
Yes.
what the letter he wrote you?
What I didn't say earlier was that my father and I had a particularly close relationship. I think parents are so influential on who and what you are and who and what you become. And as I was growing up, I would spend an inordinate amount of time with him in his study, on weekends talking about big world events. I know Mike talked about the Vietnam War. We used to talk about that, about the Americans going in there, about use of chemical weapons, about Richard Nixon, what happened in Watergate. So I had big conversations. And so my father one day, particularly one morning after I'd had a particularly tumultuous time at Channel 10, left me this note on my bedside table. And I've got to say, even though he's been gone 26 years, I've kept everything that he gave me. But this particularly shows the kind of measure of who and what he was, and where I learnt to, I hope, emulate some of what he taught me. His letter to me on the bedside table was, "Darling Anita, good morning. Don't be too upset with the shabby treatment that is so undeservedly meted out to you. Perhaps if you were less able and sure of your own..." I should be wearing my glasses. "Less able and sure of your own ability, you would fit into the shabby frame of Channel 10 chamber politics. You have already achieved a great deal in your life, and you will have greater success in the future. So don't worry too much about the decisions you will have to make, but make them without anger, a cool head, and speak your mind with dignity. After you have thought, you will know what to say and do. My love is with you unreservedly. Love, Dad."
I mean, isn't that beautiful?
Really
for that time, in the, and for a dad to tell his daughter to really stick up for herself is quite something. Yeah. And there's more to come from Dad, because he was really quite an extraordinary man. And that led you to resign, and then you went to Today, and Today was another one of those not getting the acknowledgement, not getting what you wanted. No. What happened there?
So Today's show is obviously the breakfast show that you all watch. When I was there, I went over there as the 2IC to the Today Show. It was called the supervising producer, just below the executive producer. Our hosts were George Negus and Liz Hayes. I was very lucky to work with both of them, and they were fabulous to work with. And
was there equality between George and Liz?
Yes, much more so, much more so. It's interesting. Whoever opened the show, like on Channel 10 with Gordon and Kerry-Anne, Gordon would invariably want to open the show, be the first voice, first read, do the first interview, whereas by the time I got to Channel 9, a decision had been made that we would rotate it. So there was equal voice at the table at the head of every show. Because, the imprimatur it brings, if you're the one leading, it looks like you're the one in charge. So, no, they had a great relationship. And And George also could accept that. I mean, he's very much, and still is, you know, he's quite a feminist in his own way.
Oh, he's a hippie too, like he lives up in a treehouse in Bellingen.
That's right, that's right. He's a terrific bloke. So what happened was I was the 2IC, and then not once, not twice, but 3 times my executive producer left. They went off to different programs, all the rest of it. The first time I put my hand up and I was passed over. The second time I put my hand up as the executive producer and I was doing the job and I was passed over again, and then it happened a third time because at Nine in those days, and again I'm talking about the 1980s, they had never had an executive producer either of news, sport, current affairs, any of their general programming. They had a couple of women in PR and publicity, but not in program making, not in storytelling. So the third time I was passed over, I went home, I went and saw my father was living away from home, and I talked to him about it, and he said to me, if you don't like that, you should go in and resign.
What he said was, you don't need to put up with that level of chauvinism when you're already doing the job. Don't be afraid to take a risk and leave. In my life, taking risks usually creates opportunities you might never know existed, and you resigned.
And I resigned. That's right, I did resign. I went and saw the head of News and Current Affairs at Nine, and I think he was a bit blown away. He was a guy called Ian Frickberg. I don't know if anybody remembers him. He used to work at News Limited, very senior News Limited, and then was at Nine before Peter Meakin was head of News and Current Affairs. He was so shocked that I would resign. Mind you, I didn't have children and I didn't have a big mortgage, so I was in a position to do that. So if ever I'm talking to young people, I talk about calculated risk, considered risk, knowing what your situation is. But in any case, I went and resigned, and about a day and a half later, 2 days later, I was called up, and there on his desk was a new contract for me, and he offered me a job on the biggest show then on television, which was 60 Minutes, as a producer. So it paid off for me.
Well, it was groundbreaking stuff because he probably never had a woman speak to him or resign for such a show. And you write here in the book, 60 Minutes was the perfect home for my journalistic instincts. I thrived on generating ideas and had a knack for stories that people talked about as opposed to ones that were important but didn't strike a popular chord. And I think that's really extraordinary because we all remember 60 Minutes in those days was the place to be. It broke stories, it wasn't sensationalist, it was good, hard-hitting journalists. And you worked with some extraordinary people.
Yes.
And I think, love Richard Carlton or hate him, he did provide some extraordinary...
Yes, that's right. One of my first stories was I was... finding stories is all about either talking to people, reading newspapers or being online, or somebody says something to you and you think, I could make a story out of that, whatever that story is.
Can I just interrupt then? And I think it might be good for you to tell everyone exactly what does an executive producer do, a producer does,
right.
and the whole research and stories. We were talking earlier about research with Mike Carlton, so it'd be really interesting to know.
So obviously a producer is quite a different role to an executive producer, and a producer is really, their job is to find a story idea and find that idea, flesh it out, and be able to either go off and tell it themselves or work with a reporter, a cameraman, and a camera person and a sound recordist. They're also in charge of actually the initiation, the pre-production period, pulling all of that together, finding the talent to tell that story, then organising to get on a plane and go wherever that story is, then actually working with a reporter, as you say, Richard Carlton. In my day, it was Richard Carlton, Jeff McMullen, Jennifer Byrne, Mike Munro, Jan Event had just left. But the producers, they were seriously impressive producers. And so they would pull that story together, and then they would actually work with a crew, shoot it, select camera angles, do all of that, then come back and write it and put it together, and do all the post-production, that post in an edit suite. An executive producer actually has an oversight of maybe a program. They're responsible for the program itself, for the budgets, for the employment of staff, for the contracts, for making sure that unit actually works really smoothly, but also having an oversight of the program itself to make sure it's the kind of program or content that people want to watch. And on 60 Minutes, that was particularly the case. There was a reason why 60 Minutes rated so highly in those days. The story selection around the world. For example, today, they haven't even got on a plane and gone to Turkey when we had that. You know, I would have jumped on a plane and done that, or they've done one story in the Ukraine. Well, what's happening there? Looking for those stories that we as the audience need to know about.
Well, they seem to do a lot more fluff stuff and more sensational stuff.
Because it's cheap.
Yeah. But in those days, I guess, you know, not everything went smoothly because the internet wasn't as... Is there anything that stands out to you that you kind of went, oh my God, I can't believe that happened? Or I'm sure there will be.
One of my first stories was with Richard Carlton. And I'm sure you all remember Richard. Richard didn't suffer fools gladly at all. He came out of the ABC, and you as a producer would do almost everything for him. You would do all the research, you'd brief him, you'd write the script, you did everything. So one of my first stories involved a doll bludger, a guy who'd been on the dole for 16 years, a character called Randy Savage. And I'd seen in The Australian an article about how the government was wanting to make people who were on the dole work and earn some money. And so I had tracked down this guy called Randy Savage. He'd been unemployed for 16 years. He was in Western Australia. And I asked him, would he be interested in 60 Minutes finding him a job? And he thought that was a great idea. He really didn't want to work, but he couldn't turn down actually having us seek a job for him.
Was there a payment for Randy?
No, he wasn't paid. He wasn't paid. So Richard was my reporter, and I'd never worked with Richard before. And Randy was he was about 5 foot high. He had a dog called Rastus. He had all these kids from different wives, and he really hadn't done anything with his life. It was actually quite sad. So Richard, during the interview, and we used to shoot this just one camera, Richard during the interview said at one point, and he apparently always regretted this, he said, now Randy, you know, you haven't worked, you haven't done this, you haven't been working for 16 years. You know, you're really not much of a human being, are you? And I was shocked when he said that. And, you know, which is awful.
Thing to say
and
to someone.
what does Randy Savage say? He didn't know what to say. He couldn't, you know. Mm-hmm. But one of the worst parts was we never shot 2 cameras. So what happens is when you see somebody, we film with 1 camera and then you go talk to the reporter about the questions they've asked. You've kept a list of the questions, and we had to go back and actually re-ask that.
Oh, God.
And I had to, you know, I was asking Richard to ask these questions. And I said to Randy, please, you know, you don't need to stay here. But of course he did. And that was just really difficult.
So once is bad enough, but twice
just twice was really awful. I felt
very uncomfortable. Who did you enjoy working with most in that, you know, like which reporter did you feel always gave...
Jeff McMullen.
Yeah.
Because Jeff had he was a great writer, he was a great producer, but he had a great heart. And we always aligned on the kind of stories that we wanted to do.
You did the Merrymakers together, didn't you?
We did the Merrymakers story together, we did 3 of them. They were so popular on 60 Minutes.
I'm sure some of you will remember the Merrymakers.
The Merrymakers is a group of intellectually disabled performers. And when you have music and dance combined with them, they just come alive. And we did film concerts at the Town Hall, concerts at the Opera House. And we told these most amazing stories, how they just, it filled out their world. And Jeff and I, to this day, still go to their concerts and still support them. And that's 20, 30 years ago.
We had wonderful authors earlier about working in really difficult places overseas. Did you ever do any of that sort of work where you were in war areas or where you felt threatened by anything?
I didn't. No, I was never a foreign correspondent, and I admire anybody that, you know, goes into those war zones, because that's really tough work. People like Richard Carlton and Jeff McMullen were traditionally the reporters that would go in there, and traditionally they go with male producers, because there was only really, when I started as a female producer at 60 Minutes, there was one other just leaving, and then there was just me and 12 blokes. So that's probably why I didn't pursue those sort of stories. Also, I wanted to do some more investigative stories. So, for example, do you remember the Childers Backpacker fire up in Queensland? And 15 young people died. And that was a story that always struck me because there was an arsonist and he'd deliberately, lit a fire. He'd been arrested and convicted of the fire. But I couldn't work out how 15 young people, hadn't been able to get out. And a lawyer said to me, you need to read the transcripts from the court case. And when you read the transcripts, what you discover is the reason they couldn't get out, including two beautiful young girls from Western Australia, who you probably don't even know were in that fire because there was hardly any media about them. And what we found was that there were bars on windows, beds across exits, the fire detector had been turned off, so they didn't stand a chance. So I found that story really tough, as did I find working on the Milat story, where I had to look after the families of 4 of the victims when they'd come to Australia. One was from Victoria, Deborah Everest's mother, but I had to look after the families because I was shooting a special on it. And that was one of the hardest stories I've ever worked on.
Does that sort of thing scar you? Like, how does it affect you emotionally? There's the obvious stuff, but does it sit with you?
Oh, totally. I mean, the kind of evidence that we would hear day in, day out. I mean, one day the Welsh mother of Joanne Walters, because there was so much evidence. If you remember when Milat was arrested, there was treasure trove of stuff that came from these backpackers and he'd given them to members of the family. And I remember at one stage they lifted up a T-shirt with a stab wound, a cut there. And the mother just screamed and ran out of the courtroom, a small court opposite Hyde Park. And of course I ran out after her to see what we could do. But I also had this double whammy because every day I was going to the court. That was a 3-month trial. And even Ivan Milat, in all his narcissism, agreed to be cross-examined in the witness box, which made it even harder for these families to see this man deny everything, deny. And then at night I had my father with Alzheimer's and I was racing home to see him. So I found it one of the most arduous times of my life.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think we were also incredibly moved by what happened to those people. Anyway, we've got so much more to carry. We're running out of time. So from 60 Minutes, you were there for quite some time, and Dad was diminishing, but you were offered a job with John Laws on Sky. Now, love him or hate him, John Laws has been in our life for
Can I say, sorry to interrupt, I don't know how many of you saw yesterday that Brian Walsh died. There was a story. He offered me the job. I was just thinking about that.
About you yesterday.
Yes, that's right, exactly.
Yeah. And you worked with him on Sky and you took the job, knowing full well who he was, but you did some extraordinary interviews with John Laws. And the one that I think we are all, aware of is the Christopher Skase interview. I think we'd like to know a little bit more of what that was like.
I will, but I just wanted to share with you, when I first met John, the reason I've got a soft spot for him is because he was an absolute, the biggest person in radio in Australia at that time. Alan Jones wasn't there, it was John Laws, and he was on 2UE. And we had a lunch together, and I'll never forget, I sat down, I was so nervous. Actually, he was the only person I was nervous meeting, because he came with this big reputation. And what happened was I found somebody who's very insecure, who's actually quite different to his persona, but I also had to tell him that I don't wear dresses. Now, if you follow his radio program, he talks about his handmaidens all the time and that they have to wear dresses. Well, from the moment I said to him, I don't wear dresses, his whole attitude to me changed.
In what way? What happened?
He just accepted. I think a lot of times people get so intimidated by people or situations that if they don't address the elephant in the room, he didn't care whether I didn't wear dresses or not. That's what I learned. But yes, we did
as long as you didn't tell him how bad his poetry was.
Well, I did. I did tell him how bad his poetry was. We once did an interview with Andrew Denton on the show on Foxtel, and John Laws had written this poetry book which Kevin Weldon had published. And in any case, there was this appalling line that Andrew ran round and said to John Laws, which was, "How could you write this, John? My jeans still hug me, why don't you?" Yeah.
And that's just one of many, I can tell you.
Hashtag cringe.
I think I was a bookseller at the time and people had come into Angus and Robinson asking for it. And we'd go, no. But tell us about the Christopher Skase interview, because it's so fascinating.
So Christopher Skase, as you all will recall, He fled Australia. I think there were 32 criminal charges against him under the company's code, and he'd gone to Spain. And the holy grail at that time was an interview with Christopher Skase, because there was no way he was coming back to Australia. So what I found out was that Christopher Skase's father was a broadcaster on 3DB in Victoria, and he, the father, and Christopher Skase had really admired John. So John and I drafted a letter to him, and we sent it over to the UK, and we happened to be going to the UK, and he actually agreed to do an interview with us. He didn't put any stipulations on it at all. We just had to get to Mallorca in Spain and do it at his compound called La Noria in Spain. But there is a funny story of when we were in London in June 2000, and you couldn't get a seat to Spain anywhere because it was all booked out. It was the summer season and all the planes were fully booked. So I could only get John and myself onto Ibiza Air. And I don't know if you know what Ibiza Air is.
It's Read Ryanair, I think.
Read Ryanair, cattle class. Now, John has only ever flown 1A in Qantas. That's up the front of the plane, Qantas. And so we get into Ibiza Air, and we're sitting in one of those banks of 5 to 6 seats in the centre, and he can hardly fit in because he's a very tall man. And this is also why I probably have a soft spot for him. And I could see he was getting more and more angry, and he puts his arm down here on the armrest and it breaks. And so what they do, the flight services person comes over and they've got some duct tape and they fix it up with duct tape, and I can see John is getting more and more irritated. And then next minute they come with a drink for him, and it's one of those poppers with a straw. And he only ever drinks wild turkey. Wild turkey. Yeah, that's right. Wild turkey. And then they had one of these little biscuits in a plastic wrapper. And I could see he was getting really, really pissed off. So all I could do was start laughing, because I just thought, there goes my career. And he looked at me, and I saw him start to smile, and he started giggling too. So I cut him a bit of slack, because I've seen the other side of him.
Yeah. And the interview was one of those where watching it was really uncomfortable. Was it uncomfortable being in the room?
Yes, it was. Look, Skase was a really interesting character. When we got to his place, which is a compound in Mallorca, he had photos everywhere. He had his whole life on display. Every room we went into were photos. It was actually quite sad. Yeah, and all the money that people thought he escaped with, well, John's a connoisseur of clocks and paintings. There was a Pro Heart there. There was a clock here that John said, oh, that's not worth anything. And he was actually, we saw a different side to Skase. And what he said to us when we first arrived was he'd had an operation and...
No, I'm just looking at
you.
Yeah,
he'd had an operation, and he was telling us that he had been split from here down to his belly button. And we didn't believe him. This was all part of the emphysema and all the drama of having all the paraphernalia that he wore. So right at the end of the interview, John says to him, you said to us that you've had an operation. This is all to do with your emphysema and all the rest of it. Prove it to us so you can prove why you can't travel out of Mallorca. And he paused, and it was a really effective pause. Then he started unbuttoning all his shirt down there, and sure enough, there was a scar from here down to here, which he actually used his hands to show us that was true.
Because people didn't believe him.
No,
Everyone
they
thought
didn't
it was a
believe
reason
him.
to escape.
I'm not for a moment. He should have come back to face the music, like Bond did, and done that. But he chose not to. And I think he died a very sad and lonely man.
Yeah, very sad. Look, we are going to run out of time, so I'm going to move along. You also did Helen Mirren on John Laws, and then you also went over to Andrew Denton to do Enough Rope, and you got to see the lovely Helen Mirren again.
Yes.
But there were many, many interesting people that came on Enough Rope. And, of course, there was also the Gruen transfer. There's been so many projects you've done with Andrew, which I think we all love. But there was one interview which we talked about earlier, which I always thought was one of the only times I've seen Andrew rattled, and that was the interview with Richard E. Grant. And it was one of those interviews where I didn't know who Richard E. Grant was until I saw him there. And I just absolutely fell in love with him. But I thought, he's actually a really good interviewer because he really turned the tables on Andrew. How was that?
And so Benny didn't know this story, and we were just sitting up the back here talking about, interviews that Andrew did on the program. So what had happened in advance of the Richard E. Grant interview, we had done an interview with Rachel Ward, Brian Brown's wife, and what had happened in that interview was that Andrew had actually said to her, "What is it about Brian that you love?" And she started crying. But what happened was the ABC publicity used that crying as a promo to promote the show, and Rachel didn't like that. You know, she just really, and I understand that.
Personal.
So when Richard E. Grant was coming on the show, Richard, Brian Brown and Rachel Ward are extremely good friends. So Rachel Ward said to Richard E. Grant, "You need to change that interview. What you need to do is actually research everything you can find about Andrew and use it in your interview and turn the tables on him." So for those people who saw it, I'm not sure how many of you might remember, you saw it. If you recall, every time Andrew asked him a question, he would ask a question back and he would try and flip it on its head. And it was one of the few times that Andrew couldn't manage that interview because Richard completely took control of it.
Yeah, it was quite
It
extraordinary.
was a fabulous interview.
But you did lots of really interesting interviews
Yeah.
on the Denton show.
Yes, we did.
Other than that one, what others stick out for you that you found out something about that person that you didn't know?
Oh, there's so many
So
of
many.
them. Look, one of my favourites is Sir David Attenborough. We were doing a show called Elders, which was all about the wisdom of people 65 and older. We did Dame Elizabeth Murdoch, Muhammad Yunus, Isabel Allende, and Sir David Attenborough was one of them. And we went to his home in London and we spent half a day with him. And honestly, what you see is what you get. He is as beautiful a human as
Because that's what the thing is that always comes across with him, is that you... And when you're in that situation, for you as the executive producer, are you navigating the interview as well? Are you helping Andrew with questions, with what needs to be done?
We've always pre-planned an interview, but you never know what somebody's going to
Yeah.
say, and you should follow where they're going, not what your questions are. And what often happens in interviews is people are so locked into the questions that they've got that they actually miss what somebody said. That actually happened to Andrew one time. We were interviewing a Pakistani journalist called Hamid Mia, and he had got as close as you could to Osama bin Laden. And during that interview, Hamid Mir mentioned, while we were recording this, that al-Zarqawi, the third in charge of Al-Qaeda, had been in Australia in the late 1990s recruiting members of Al-Qaeda. And Andrew, because he was so focused on things, had missed that. So I was able to get that to him and we backtracked to him. But that was the exception to the norm.
Yeah,
Andrew would usually be right on the ball.
Yeah, but that's an extraordinary thing to say, that those people were here recruiting.
They were here recruiting
Yeah.
in the late 19... I noticed there was a piece in one of the papers a couple of years ago, but it didn't really explore what that meant in terms of that Al-Qaeda being here, recruiting so, intensively on the ground.
But what I'm hearing too from you is that, you don't miss much either.
Well, that's your
So
job as a
that's your
producer. Your job as a journalist or producer, whatever you want to call it, is to make sure that if you're working with, talent, with whomever is interviewing, that they're absolutely on top of their brief, and that you're on top of their brief as well.
Yeah, and
you've got their back.
And you've got their back. That's right, because they're your priority.
Yeah.
But there have been some strange things that have happened, and one, and we're going to talk about him because it's happened to you recently too, is the interview with Rolf Harris.
Oh yes. Well, that was unfortunate. This is about 6-8 years before he was arrested and charged with sexual assault of these. I think it's quite a number of young women.
Oh yeah, lots.
So we had at the time that we had set up an interview with Rolf Harris. He was huge. He had just painted the Queen's portrait. He had a show on the BBC. I went to say the ABC, the BBC. He was down in Glastonbury doing the Stairway to Heaven. Yeah. So he was extremely popular. And we had an hour and a half with him just close to his home outside of London. And what happened was all the crew had set up and they'd walked out, and Andrew and I were standing in one room off to one side. And all of a sudden Rolf walked in, and there's just the two of us standing there, and he came straight over to me, and without even acknowledging Andrew, he said, "I need a hug." And all of a sudden he had his arms around me and pulled me Totally against his body, and including obviously the groin area. And so I was so shocked, as was Andrew. He couldn't believe what was happening, that I pushed back and I said, "That's not a hug. That's a grope." He never looked at me and he never spoke to me again. And that was the same modus operandi that he used with all these young women that came out in the court case.
And you've just been recently interviewed about that.
Yes,
time.
I think ITV and then Netflix are doing a 2-part series on the Rolf Harris and what happened. Because he certainly went from being an absolute superstar in Australia to persona non grata. And so he should.
And then there was the Bill Clinton interview, and along the same lines of this sort of subject matter and where you were heading with this. So, and we are running out of time. I know we want to talk about your dad a bit too. I'm sorry if that's too loud, but do you want to read that little bit about Bill?
Yeah.
And because he, I remember Natasha Stotspoyer saying that he walked into Parliament House and he had this aura about him, that he was so magnificent, but that he gave her this very sexy wink as he was leaving.
He was so charismatic.
He was so charismatic.
We shot an exclusive interview with him in London at the Ritz-Carlton, and we had half an hour, and it was just after the publication of his autobiography, My Life, and it was about 1,000 pages long, and it was that thick, and everybody was going to L for Lewinsky. That's all people wanted to know about. And in our production meeting before we'd left Australia, I said, we've got to ask a question about Lewinsky, and everybody's like, no, we can't, that's too low rent, we don't want to ask that. And I said, no, hold it. We need to ask about a question about a father, and we need to find the way of asking a question to him, because, it's difficult at the best of times to get politicians off script. They just say what they want to say.
Yes.
So this is the question that we shaped, and this was his answer. The question to Clinton that day in the Ritz-Carlton was, talking to Hillary must have been hard, but I can only imagine talking to Chelsea, his daughter, was excruciating. Where do you start with a conversation like that? And so immediately you're taking him to a different place, which is not a political place, it's being a father. And you could see him going off-piste. You could just see there was that the shutters went down for just a nanosecond because he's very rehearsed. This was his answer. Sooner or later, every child learns that her parents or his parents aren't perfect. And that's a terrifying enough thing when your kid knows you're not perfect anymore. This went way beyond that.
Mm-hmm. And that leads us to you finding out that your dad wasn't perfect and why you started writing this book. So at this dinner party, what did that person say to you about your father?
So I'm at a family dinner party in 2013 in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, full of journalists and lawyers. They've all drunk a heap of champagne. It was quite raucous.
Messy.
And they're talking about a triple murder case that was happening, the Jeffrey Gillam case in New South Wales. And all of a sudden there's a pause in the conversation, and one of the barristers looked at me and said, do you know about the infamous court case in the 1950s involving your father? And this was way before I was born, and I had no idea what he was talking about.
And bear in mind that Anita and her dad were so close, So close. I had no idea. But as both a daughter and as a journalist, every bone in my body wanted to find out about this court case because I didn't know what it was. And I was desperate to find out, because the one thing with a journalist is they've got to know everything, or at least a little bit about everything, and hopefully a lot about, more than just a little. So what did you find out, Anita?
So I found out that I've told hundreds of stories all over the world, as I've told you some of the stories, but there are many, many more people that I've been fortunate to meet and tell stories of, only just to discover that probably the richest story of my life was within my own family.
It's a tough story to tell. We don't have time now to tell it, so you have to but there's been, we can give a hint of what happened.
It's interesting that Mike Carlton...
Sorry, and this is interesting because Anita she said to me, I felt so vulnerable writing this book, being on the other side, now telling a story about my mum, my dad, my sister, my brother, people she's never met, and it's a very difficult story to tell.
Yes, it is. journalism is all about telling other people's stories, as you know. It's never about telling your own. And particularly for me growing up in commercial television, showing vulnerability when writing something that's deeply personal was really hard. Took me about 9 years to get to this stage of publishing it because I didn't want to inject any of my story into it, and I didn't know whether... Originally it started out as a family story, but what happened was and I employed an investigative journalist to help me, a woman who'd worked on Four Corners, who was one of the best in the country. And we uncovered the most remarkable... So every time we went down a rabbit hole, as Mike Carlton was saying earlier, we found more story and more story and more story. And usually a book, in my experience, is predicated on a story, and then you build a story around that one story. In my case, every chapter has a different story because... I went and interviewed John Howard. That was my father's commercial lawyer. He mentored Carla Zampatti. He mentored Dick Smith. I was finding out things about him that I had no understanding of, including being jailed during the war, being interned here in Australia, how people that had fled persecution overseas were then so persecuted here in Australia because really we were so monocultural, we were so white, we were so ignorant. And in fact, today we're still, to a degree, ignorant about, those refugees and people that are coming into Australia.
Oh, absolutely. I listened to Craig Foster speak the other day at an event, and he was really remarkable talking about a lot of the refugees he has met. But the story basically is around Anita's dad and what she thought he had married her mum, but he had married a couple of other people beforehand.
Well, 4. But it's not just the personal, it's the professional, and it's also what it paints is a picture of Australia.
Yeah.
And there's actually, I was talking to Kerry O'Brien from the ABC, and he said to me, because I look at the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s in Australia, there's not a lot of social history that covers that period. Yeah. And I didn't really realise that.
And you found all sorts of things when you were looking through the newspapers and doing your own investigation.
That's right. Well, there's espionage, there's...
he was interned.
He was interned. There's just, where you find out the conditions, that the way that people were treated, that we treated people who had fled persecution.
And still do.
Was a shocker.
Yeah. So there's a lot in this book that is quite remarkable and fascinating and interesting, and... I think you'll all really love it.
I guess he was an international man of mystery.
Well,
if I had to summarise him.
Yeah. And the thing is that you had him up here on a huge pedestal and finding out all this stuff about your dad. Did that change for you, how you felt about him?
Look, I still adore him. I still love him. As I said earlier, he's been gone 26 years. But I didn't see his flaws and complexities like we all have. I just wasn't aware of them. And now I'm grateful that I am. And I also understand more about me, the motivations, the machinations, what I've done, because I understand a parent really well. And the one thing I would say for those people that still have parents and those who have children is to not to tell them about your lives, because ours was about tennis and piano and ballet and all the mechanics of life. And even though I had those deep conversations with him, I really now know I never really knew him.
Yeah. Oh, that's such an interesting... Yeah, because who are we when we're not with our kids?
That's right.
Sometimes we're very different.
Very different. And most of us, as I said at the beginning, are looking forward, not looking back. And I'm sure that children really regret what they don't know about their parents, or indeed any of their loved ones, and that you learn them at a funeral or a farewell.
Yeah, absolutely. How are we going for time?
Well, we're right on time.
We're right on.
I've been asked, look, I think we won't take questions because we've listened to this wonderful conversation. Well,
thank you. And thank you, Benny.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you.
Can we just have one more? Can you tell everyone about the Jane Fonda and Sharon Stone story?
Or do you want the that one? Yeah. Goldie Hawn. Goldie Hawn's a better one. So Goldie Hawn had written an autobiography. This is during the Enough Rope days, called "A Lotus Grows in Mud." I mean, I don't get the title, but in any case. And so we'd organised to do an interview with her, and we'd booked the studio at the ABC, and it was a one-off. And Andrew was there and the crew, and it's very costly to book a studio and then the facilities for a satellite out of Los Angeles. And we're sitting around the studio waiting, and Goldie hadn't turned up, and we probably waited about 45 minutes. Finally, she sat down. And the interview started, and all she kept saying was, well, in my book this, in my book that, in my... You know, and so you weren't getting anything of her. So I raced up to the control room, and I rang her manager in Los Angeles. And I started talking to him and said, look, we've waited 45 minutes now, we're just getting the book. It's the ABC. The ABC is all about not promoting things rather than, you know, it's become a bit commercial in areas today, but it shouldn't. So what he did was he called me an effing C. And so I just hung up. I raced down and I told Andrew, and we immediately pulled the plug on this interview, and that's the interview that's never gone to air.
Thank you, Anita.
Thanks, Penny, very much.